So welcome everyone to the first colloquium of the academic year. I'm not going to say very much because I would love to just turn it over to Kathy to introduce our first speaker. So welcome everyone to the first colloquium of the academic year. Okay, now I've muted the streaming. So go ahead, Kathy, whenever you're ready.
This is so complex. Thank you so much, Charles. I'm so happy to be able to introduce Katie. Before we get, let me actually start my share screen. I have some slides here. Okay, so then I will start this. And you can all see that, right? Okay. Before we get to this talk, I want to spend a few minutes introducing Kathryn Franich and to talk about the path that she's taken to the current moment. And at the same time, I want to send a message to our current master's and doctoral students because you're facing your own pathway into this field. So in telling some of Katie's stories, I want to inspire you to think about your own work and the way that you're going. So the first time I talked with Katie, it was 2008. She was inquiring about the master's program in applied linguistics at BU, and that's what the program used to be called. She had written to us saying, I'm actually in Guatemala right now, working for an NGO whose missions include educating the global community about Mayan language and culture, as well as cultivating native language skills through teaching classes in the Quiche language. I thought, wow. So I called her in Guatemala, and she seemed to be a great fit for the program. So in 2008, when she arrived, she began working as a research assistant on my Northern Pomo language documentation project. And in spring of 2009, her second semester in the MA program, she took field methods. So that semester, I was teaching field methods, and I had been searching and searching for a good language consultant, the person who students work with to learn about the language. And it's not always easy to find a good consultant. Ideally, they speak a language that has not been fully described because you want the class to give people the real challenges of language documentation. And you also want the consultant to be a person who's patient and a good teacher and fun to work with, ideally. But that can be really hard to find. So that year, I got a recommendation from a faculty member in the French department about a graduate student named Ariane Gabu. And Ariane was teaching French, but her first language was a language from Cameroon named Medʉmba. So I Googled the language and I was shocked to find that there was like nothing written about it, which isn't typical, right? So we focused on Medʉmba that semester in field methods, and it turned out that Ariane was an incredible consultant and a wonderful person. And Katie started working on the language, and she wrote a great paper on spatial frames in Medʉmba, and she got an A in the class. But it did not end there. In summer 2009, a group of us met to continue working with Ariane, and Katie had an idea. And she began to urge all of us, let's write an NSF grant to support field work in Cameroon. And I had just become a full professor, and I had way too much on my plate, and I had just had major knee surgery, and I was really doubtful we could pull it off because the students were all master's students and undergrads. And I just thought, you know, this isn't going to work. But the same summer, I had convinced students to attend the LSA Summer Institute in Berkeley. Doesn't this look wonderful? You should all go to these if you can. They're incredibly fun. So Katie took classes. She went to the Institute and she took classes on documenting endangered languages and on African tone systems. And she became even more convinced we should write an NSF grant proposal. So I finally gave in and I began to work with John Barnes and Katie and other students in constructing a proposal that we could send to NSF. And I had planned to work on Medʉmba for a second year in field methods anyway, because it's an amazing language, and Ariane was still there and she's a fabulous consultant. But now the work took on a more intensive character because we were going to submit a grant proposal to do field work. And the students and Ariane would do the field work. So at many points, I was overwhelmed with other work and the project would have fallen by the wayside, but Katie kept me and John Barnes and Ariane and the other students on track. And then the grant came through. So then the fieldwork started. But after the project was funded, a new level of logistic problems arose, planning for the fieldwork itself. So here again, Katie's organizational abilities came into play, and she collaborated closely with Ariane to make it possible for 5 people and a baby to travel around villages in Cameroon for almost a month in August 2010 without a mishap. And they returned with about 70 hours of high quality elicitation. Katie also established a strong working relationship and personal connection with Medʉmba speakers who ran an organization called CPOM, which is a non-NGO, whose mission is language and literacy development in Medʉmba. And here's another picture of the group in that setting. And actually, this is they went back a second year to do more field work. And so here is CPOM again, the second year. And if you recall, Katie had earlier worked with an organization in Guatemala, which was also an organization started by indigenous people to support their own mother tongues. And Katie's work with both of these organizations really reflects who she is. There are many linguists who see the importance of describing threatened languages, but not many can find ways to interface in a way that community members themselves would deem valuable. So Katie is that kind of linguist, and I really appreciate that. Her personal qualities and abilities also made her a wonderful organizer for BUCLD. And some of you here know how challenging that can be. Yes, we all laugh. Okay. So after 2 years in our MA program, she finished her MA thesis on tone docking and spreading in the Medʉmba verbal complex, and then went on to the PhD program in linguistics at the University of Chicago. And in 2017, she filed her dissertation, chaired by Professor Alan Yu, entitled The Interaction of Prominence, Rhythm, and Tone in Medʉmba. So overall, she's made 5 trips to Cameroon to document Medʉmba, I believe, supported by the 2 grants we got while she was at BU, and then by an NSF dissertation improvement grant that she received, which you should all apply for when you're doing your dissertation. And then, drum roll, by her own NSF grant, where she is the PI of a 4-year, $389,000 NSF grant entitled Speech and Communicative Timing Across Languages and Linguistic Contexts. Since 2018, she's been an assistant professor at the University of Delaware, and her work is increasingly focused on those bigger topics that you'll hear about today. But before we start, I want to point to the way that work like Katie's, which is deeply focused descriptive work on a particular language, can lead one into the larger empirical and theoretical issues that have an impact cross-linguistically, which you can see happening in her work here. So the story of her work is something to think about as you go forward with your own work. And we all know it can be very challenging as you're moving forward as a master's student, as a doctoral student, finding your own research topics, but you have to keep focused on where you're going. And I would suggest that Katie actually might be a really good person to talk to about this. So now I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and I'm going to let Katie take over and put in her slides. And I'm looking forward to hearing this talk.
Thank you, Kathy. That was really nice. And I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Oh, actually, sorry. I need to reshare that so that the sound is shared as well. There we go. Can everybody see that? Okay. Well, thanks so much, Kathy, and thanks to Charles for organizing the colloquium and for inviting me to come in and share some of my work with you all. Obviously, BU had a major impact on the trajectory of my career. And so it's really special to be invited to come back and spend some time with you all. And like Kathy said, I'm always happy to talk with students currently in the program, and especially if you're interested in field work and those topics. I'd love to, and I've already gotten to hear from many of you today, and it's been really nice hearing about the exciting work that's going on in the department, hearing about how the department, which was already wonderful as a program, has grown and taken a new faculty, and it's just really, really exciting to see. So I'm going to talk about Medʉmba today, and specifically about the role of metrical prominence in coordinating speech and the body. And so the first thing that I'd like to do is just highlight an example from English with these two words, gerbil and giraffe. And I just wanted to start by saying that what I'm about to say is based on my particular dialect of English, and probably there will be people here who don't agree with all of the judgments that I have, but these are judgments that I have and that others share with me. So that's kind of the perspective. But so we have these two words, gerbil and giraffe, and if we marked stress in English, the primary difference between these words is that gerbil has primary stress, giraffe has final stress. And so if we were to look phonetically at what's going on between these two words, we would see that the stress syllable in gerbil has longer duration, it has greater intensity, it has higher fundamental frequency indicated by this blue line than the corresponding unstressed syllable in the word giraffe. We also find in many dialects of English that unstressed syllables undergo vowel reduction, and stressed syllables tend to be realized with more peripheral vowel qualities within the vowel space. Unstressed syllables get reduced to somewhere around schwa. From a phonological standpoint, we can model these asymmetries between stressed and unstressed syllables by talking about these strong, weak alternations in a metrical tree like this one. From Liberman 1975. And we can sort of build up from the individual word level of these alternating strong and weak syllables into larger structures within the prosodic hierarchy. Today's talk is going to be primarily focused on this level of the prosodic hierarchy, the foot level, okay, or the metrical foot level. So another thing that's interesting about stress is that it allows us to, it sort of serves an important role in the coordination of speech to music. So if we take this example, this children's song that lots of children in the US learn growing up, Old MacDonald Had a Farm, and we plug in those two words that I brought up earlier, you get these two lines here, at least, again, these are my intuitions. If you have different ones, I will be really interested actually to hear about your different intuitions. But my intuition is that these are two rhythmically different lines depending on which word you use. So in the first line, on that farm, he had a gerbil, E-I-E-I-O, versus on that farm, he had a giraffe, E-I-E-I-O, or on that farm, he had a giraffe, E-I-E-I-O. Okay, so the main thing is that this second measure has a different rhythmic structure depending on which word you've inserted here. And basically the goal is to align the stressed syllables with the odd numbered beats within the measure. Okay, and that's why we get this sort of difference depending on whether we have initial stress or final stress on that animal word. And then the final thing about stress that I'd like to highlight is the way that the role that it plays in coordination with the body, particularly in co-speech gesture. So for example, if these two women are talking and this woman on the right says, but he didn't pay his taxes for 10 years, you'd be very likely to see her make a hand gesture or a gesture of some kind, perhaps a hand gesture that would very likely align with one of the stressed syllables here, especially with that first syllable in taxes. So, but he didn't pay his taxes for 10 years, right? So it seems like stress is also playing this kind of coordinative role when it comes to co-speech gesture. So the generalizations that I've given you so far about stress in English is that stress is associated with phonetically measurable acoustic correlates, but stress syllables also serve as a locus for coordination between speech and other systems like music and gesture. And so the question that I'd like to set up for today's talk is, to what extent do languages of the world exhibit metrical prominence asymmetries like the ones that are sort of exponed by stress in English? And we can sort of break this down into two parts. The first being, how do metrical prominence asymmetries compare across languages in terms of their phonetic and phonological properties? And the second, how do metrical prominence asymmetries compare across languages in terms of their coordinative properties? And so the language of focus today is going to be Medʉmba, the language that you've already heard about from Kathy, but just to recap, this is a Grassfields Bantu language spoken in Cameroon by about 200,000 speakers. Medʉmba is arguably descended from Proto-Bantu, but it does look quite different from some of the kind of better studied Southern and Eastern Bantu languages, and then it has a more isolating morphological structure. It has very few affixes, and in the place of those affixes, it actually has very, very rich tonal morphology. Here's a map of Africa to show you where Cameroon is located here on the west coast. And if we kind of zoom in, it's this green region here is the west region of Cameroon, and Medʉmba is spoken about here. And so the reason that I'm going to focus on Medʉmba is that a lot of African languages have been argued to lack evidence of stress, okay, like the phonetic evidence that I showed you before for stress in English. And even in cases where it seems like they may have something like stress, it seems that the evidence is not unambiguously for stress. So I'll explain what that means in a minute, but basically these languages don't have unambiguous evidence of stress or metrical prominence, and so they provide us with this kind of challenging test case for the idea that word level accent might be universal to languages. On the flip side, African languages of different families show phonological patterns, which seem to point to elevated prominence of certain syllables. And so we're going to be focused in particular on stem initial syllables in Medʉmba. So just a little roadmap of where we're going to go. I'm first going to talk about some speech production experiments that highlight the role of metrical structure in speech coordination. Then we're going to turn to text settings, so turning to some music, Medʉmba speech-based music, to look at coordinative properties there. And then finally, we're going to look at coordination in co-speech gesture. So as I mentioned, Medʉmba exhibits this particular patterning among stems, which is very common actually to languages in the sort of northwest region of sub-Saharan Africa, actually across a number of different language families. So not limited to Bantu, but across Niger-Congo and even beyond, whereby stem initial syllables are found to realize the full range of consonantal and vocalic contrasts, whereas non-initial and non-stem syllables realize only a subset of these contrasts. So in Medʉmba, only schwa. I'll show you here what we're looking at in terms of these asymmetries. So in blue, you have all the wonderful consonants and vowels that are realizable in stem initial position. And in the red box, you have all the ones that can occur in stem medial, stem final, or affix positions. And so the question is whether or not these asymmetries are associated with metrical accent. Or prominence, metrical prominence asymmetries, to kind of put it more neutrally. So we do have some hints from the phonology that we may be dealing with metrical structure. For example, we have this process of spirantization. So some of the asymmetries that we saw on the previous slide are actually attributable to this process of spirantization, whereby, for example, a velar stop lenites between two vowels, but only in certain environments. And I should have attributed some of this to Nick Danis, who actually wrote his master's thesis on this topic. So we get lenition, for example, within a verb stem. So the verb stem release kara, okay, it underlyingly would be kaka, but it's realized as kara. Similarly, if we position this verb stem before a VC pronominal enclitic, we also get lenition in that environment. However, if we position the same verb stem before a vowel initial regular noun or a proper name, for example, we find that there's no lenition here, so we get kakange instead of kagange. And similarly, we don't find lenition on stem initial consonants, even word internally. So if we concatenate this infinitival prefix here, we have the intervocalic position for this velar stop, but it does not lenite, okay? So we may want to kind of think about the structures that may be happening here. And one way to approach this would be to say that the verb stem is basically coextensive with a foot. And then by a process, say, of prosodic adjunction, we could add on this infinitival prefix to get ourselves a prosodic word. And then the generalization for this Linician pattern is that K spirantizes intervocalically within a foot, okay, within a metrical foot. So just to summarize so far, stem initial or foot initial syllables, as the case may be, carry more consonantal and vocalic contrasts in Medʉmba. They also carry more tonal contrasts, which I haven't told you about, but you can take my word for it for the moment. And they also resist Linician. So that's all well and good, except that these patterns are also consistent with another type of prominence, which is not necessarily metrically based. So across different languages, we see that the initial position of certain domains, such as the word or the foot, tends to be targeted for fortition. Okay, so that type of process would have a very similar result to the ones that we just saw. And because words in this language are relatively short, we don't really have the proper environment to tease out the difference between what a word initial pattern versus a truly metrically prominent pattern would look like. And so we sort of don't really know, given the evidence that we have, whether these patterns truly reflect metrical prominence in a kind of rhythmic sense. And this is something that John Barnes has brought up in his work. And so, so basically, we're sort of looking for additional evidence here that we've got a sort of true rhythmic prominence asymmetry going on in this language. And so the way that I've chosen to approach this question is through the use of this paradigm called the speech cycling paradigm that was developed by Cummins and Port and by Keiichi Tajima in the 90s. And it's a super boring task, but a really interesting one. You have people repeat sentences in time to a metronome set to increasingly faster rates. And you look at basically where they are aligning syllables within the repetition cycle. Okay, so the interesting finding across a number of different languages, typologically unrelated languages, including English, Japanese, Korean, Jordanian Arabic, Brazilian Portuguese, is that people tend to align the last metrically prominent syllable with certain positions within the repetition cycle, such as the halfway point, 1/3 of the way through the repetition cycle, or 2/3 of the way through the repetition cycle. Okay, so I'm gonna clap my hands and pretend to be a metronome for a second, and we'll take this sentence, dig for a duck, which is one of the ones that's been used in this experiment in English. And the way that English speakers will typically approach this task is to go dig for a duck, 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 dig for a duck. So I just started clapping my hands in double time to show you that duck is basically occurring halfway through the original cycle that I was clapping. Okay, so and duck being the final metrically prominent syllable here. Another pattern that we find very frequently is dig for a duck, dig for a duck, dig for a duck, dig for a duck, where duck occurs 1/3 of the way through the repetition cycle, or we can get dig for a duck, dig for a duck, dig for a duck, dig for a duck, with duck 2/3 of the way through the repetition cycle. So those are overwhelmingly the 3 patterns that people really gravitate to in the task. And again, this has been done on a number of different languages. And sort of just to give you a little bit of theoretical background, the way that this has been explained is through sort of recasting the traditional prosodic hierarchy that you see here on the left, so the phonological phrase and feet and syllables, as a system of coupled oscillators. So oscillators operating at different frequencies, which are phase locked and frequency locked to one another, so that you can capture things like a binary foot in terms of a 1 to 2 phase locking pattern of syllables to feet, or a ternary foot pattern as a 1 to 3 phase locking pattern between syllables and feet. So that's sort of, I can say more about that later if you're interested in hearing, but that's the sort of basics of the theory behind this. And so the question is, do stem initial syllables in Medʉmba show similar patterning in the speech cycling task to stressed or accented syllables in other languages? And so here are the constructions. I did 2 experiments here. And so here's the first experiment, and we're going to be, and these are 4-syllable utterances, just like the ones that have been used in English. We're going to be focused primarily on the final syllable here. So the first sentence 1A, menchakmbiba, the child lost a bicycle. This final syllable is, we're going to call this a stem initial syllable. So technically it's also stem final because it's a monosyllabic noun. However, it realizes the sort of full range of consonantal and vocalic contrast that I pointed out before. So for our purposes here, it's considered stem initial. And we're going to contrast this with the final syllable of this sentence, men chakmbiba, the child waited, where we have b as the final syllable of this verb wait. Okay, so that's a true stem final syllable. We'll also compare the penultimate syllable across these constructions, which is stem initial in both cases. And so we don't necessarily expect a difference in alignment between those 2 syllables. And then in this other experiment, the second experiment, I'm comparing the penultimate syllable in sentences like this, mennenitsi, the child knows how to choose, where we've got an infinitival prefix in penultimate position, versus mennenutsa, where we've got, that means the child knows their problems. And this is a monosyllabic noun, stem initial syllable, problems. So we've got a non-stem syllable versus a stem initial syllable that we're comparing here. So there were 14 subjects that participated across the 2 experiments, and subjects repeated 3 sentences per condition. The sentences were matched across conditions as much as possible for phonetic content, and they repeated the sentences at 15 different rates, which were controlled by a metronome. And as far as the predictions, we predict that stem initial syllables should be more likely to cluster around these simple harmonic phase positions of 1/3 of the way, halfway, 2/3 of the way through the metronome cycle. Okay, I might refer to those as simple harmonic phase positions or SHP positions. While stem final and non-stem syllables should occur farther from these positions, as they're predicted to be parsed with the preceding syllable into a foot. Okay, they're not heading their own feet, they're parsed with what comes before them. So here are the results from experiment 1. So again, we're comparing the final syllable in these 2 sentences here. Blue lines represent stem initial syllables, and the red lines represent stem final syllables. So in the penultimate position, we were comparing 2 stem initial syllables, which again, we didn't necessarily expect to differ in their alignment, and indeed they did not differ in their alignment. In the final position, we have a stem initial syllable in one condition versus a stem final syllable in the other condition, and we did find a significant difference as expected in alignment there, with the stem final syllable occurring significantly earlier than the corresponding stem initial syllable. So on the right hand of your screen, you'll see 4 more plots here, and I can say more about what these distributions actually represent later on if you're interested. But basically, the main thing to sort of notice is that the largest peak in these distributions for these 3 stem initial syllables aligns quite well with this dotted line, which represents the closest harmonic phase position to the repetitions. Okay, so it's 1/3 of the way through the cycle here and here, and it's halfway through the cycle here. But notice that this stem final syllable, the largest peak, is actually quite a bit earlier than the closest harmonic phase position, the halfway point. Okay, so as predicted, we have a difference in alignment between stem initial and stem final syllables, but even more importantly, those stem final syllables occur farther from these harmonic phase positions than the stem initial syllables. Going now to experiment 2, we see again an overall difference in alignment between the stem initial syllable and this prefix syllable. Okay, stem initial here, prefix here. And again, we find pretty close alignment of this peak in the data for the stem initial syllable with the 1/3 of the way through the repetition cycle harmonic phase position. The prefix, on the other hand, occurs quite a bit earlier than that harmonic phase position. Okay, so again, this is as expected. So to conclude this first part of the talk, stem initial syllables did seem to be attracted more strongly to prominence attracting positions in the repetition cycle than non-initial and non-stem syllables. And these patterns resemble the kind of patterns that we see for stress syllables in languages like English that show clear phonetic evidence of metrical structure. And the similar behavior in speech cycling across languages suggests that stem initial prominence also reflects a kind of rhythmic prominence in Medʉmba, which is consistent with this idea that this is a sort of true metrical prominence and not just a domain edge effect. So moving on, we're going to talk more about coordination in other domains. First, we're going to talk about music. And one of the reasons is that musical rhythms have been used as a window into aspects of language, metrical structure, and timing since the beginning of metrical theory. They formed a really, really important building block for the theory itself. And if we look across a bunch of different languages and cultural contexts, we see that mapping of stressed or metrically prominent syllables to musical beats or the use of metrical structure for structuring music is a very common strategy across different languages and cultures. So it seems worthwhile to examine in the current context. And I gave you an example already of a situation where we have this happening in English. So gerbil and giraffe, their stress patterns determine the overall rhythm for these lines in a song. So the question is, what role does metrical structure play in the alignment of syllables in speech-based music in Medʉmba? And this is joint work with Dr. Ange Bergson-Lendja, who is actually pictured in some of those photos. He's been working as a collaborator with me and other researchers since 2010, since our first field trip. So we've been working on this together. He's a native Medʉmba speaker, and he's from this area. So that we were collecting data in Bangulap village in Cameroon, which is just outside the city of Bangante, and specifically we're working in this quarter Latmfen, where he's from, where his family is from. And we recorded these two Medʉmba folk songs there. And these songs feature an ensemble which is typical of the region, where you have percussionists led by a master drummer. In this case, the master drummer is seated here, who interact in call and response form with community members as they dance around. And I'll show you some videos of that coming up. So we've transcribed the rhythms of various ensemble instruments and singers in the group. We haven't transcribed all of the instruments, but that's ultimately the goal, but I've sort of picked out some that seem especially important. So the first one is the menfama, the drum played by the master drummer. There's actually two drums pictured here. The one that's we're focusing on is this one that's positioned on the ground here. And then we have the ndunlam, which is a glockenspiel made of iron. We have the ndo or whistle, and then we have the ncha, tin shakers, which is a nice little idiophone for you there, ncha, ncha, ncha. And then we have the voices of the master drummer and dancers. So we had to make some decisions here about how exactly we were going to represent these rhythmic patterns musically, obviously. And what we opted to do was to adopt Western musical notation, measured musical notation with time signatures to do this. And there are plenty of reasons why this might not be the best approach, and we could certainly talk about those after the talk if you'd like. But many different music theorists, including music theorists from this region, opt for this method in order to be able to do some sort of cross-culture and cross-musical comparison. And so we opted to do the same in this case. So you'll see that we have two time signatures selected for the first song. We've transcribed the song in 2/4 time, and the second song is transcribed in 12/8 time. And basically, we're just examining how syllables in various positions within Medʉmba words align with the overall rhythmic structure of these songs. So I'm going to play you a little video here of the first song. And this is a nice video because it sort of allows you to watch the different voices as they enter into the song. And so first we hear the master drummer kind of call out. And then the ndunlam glockenspiel player comes in, and then the master drummer starts to drum. You start to hear the whistle when one of the women dancing around in the circle is playing the whistle. And then the ncha, tin shakers will start up. You'll see the guy with those. So here it goes. And I'm sorry if this is too loud. I've tried to adjust it so that it won't be, but be forewarned.
Yes, it's the thing. It's the thing. And when I will start, you will do the same. Yeah. I'll give you that.
All right, so you get an idea for what the ensemble kind of looks like and sounds like. And this is what we've come up with for the transcription of this first song. I should say I have worked, I'm a musician myself, and I've worked with some musician and music theorist friends on these transcriptions, so it's not all me doing this. But anyway, so I want to sort of just highlight first the overall structure of what's going on with the drums, or the percussion. And you can sort of see that the shakers are kind of playing this pretty straight ahead, just playing on every beat, a very, you know, it's not varying very much, not varying at all from measure to measure. Similarly, the Ndunlam is playing this very repetitive pattern, the glockenspiel. And then the whistle and the master drummer play these slightly more complex patterns, especially the master drummer, you know, does a lot more kind of improvising throughout the song. So now coming down to the voices, we're going to start with the dancer's voice here on the bottom. And I've highlighted here all of the stem initial syllables in red. And then affixes are in green, and basically anything else. So we've got pronouns here in black, a focus marker. We've got some kind of onomatopoeia here, another pronoun here. But basically, so you see the red syllables, these stem initial syllables, overwhelmingly seem to like to occur in certain positions. So these stars that I've added in here are marking the beginnings of beats. Okay, so where beats are beginning in this sort of 2/4 pattern that we're imagining. So the 1 and the 2. And you can see that that chuba to say is lining up nicely with this second beat here. The word for where is lining up with the second beat here. Chuba again is lining up with the second beat here on the beat. Other things like the focus marker here tends to occur on fractions of the beat rather than on the beat. Similarly, we find that affixes, so this prefix, tend to occur on fractions of the beat as opposed to on the beat. So this is the master drummer's lineup here, actually, and this is the continuation of the dancers down here. So that's the first song. And I'm going to play you a little bit of this second song. I don't have a good video of this one, so I'm just going to play you the audio for now. All right, so this one we've transcribed with a different time signature in 12/8. So there are sort of 4 main beats that, again, the necha is kind of beating. So 4 beats per measure. And then the Ndunlam is kind of subdividing these in groups of 3. And then again, the master drummer and the whistle are playing these other patterns. And so once again, in this song, I've highlighted for you the stem initial syllables and the affixes here, and you can see the stem initial syllables in red and the affixes in green. And once again, we find that the stem initial syllables seem to really like to occur on the beat, and these affixes tend to occur on these fractions of the beat. Here's another line in this same song where we get we added in a stem final syllable to the mix. Okay, so from yutta to seduce with the iterative suffix, to bend with the iterative suffix. You see again, the initial syllable is aligning with the beginning of the beat there, and the stem final syllable and the are on these fractions of the beat. And again, more stem initial syllables, beginnings of beats, affixes, and stem final syllables on fractions of beats there. So this is kind of a quantification of what's happening on various beats between the dancers on the left-hand side and the master drummer on the right side. And I've kind of broken things down into affixes, focus markers, pronouns, stem initials, and stem final syllables, which are the prevalent things that we see in these two pieces of music. And I've opted to further divide on the beat locations into even numbered beats and odd numbered beats, because there were some sort of interesting patterns happening there. So the first thing to highlight is that first of all, even odd numbered beats both have a very large proportion of stem initial syllables here in blue. But we find even more stem initial syllables occurring on the even numbered beats than on the odd numbered beats for dancers. The master drummer has sort of the reverse. Overall, again, lots of stem initial syllables on both even and odd numbered beats and the beat, but slightly more on the odd numbered beats than on the even numbered beats. We can talk about that in a bit if you'd like. And then I also want to highlight here what's happening on these fractions, which for the dancers is overwhelmingly not stem initial syllables. So affixes, focus markers, pronouns, and stem final syllables. In the case of drummer, we find affixes and pronouns. We also actually do find a fair number of stem initial syllables for drummer occurring on those fractions of the beat. And I think that's kind of speaks to the fact that the master drummer is sort of the creative centerpiece of the ensemble. So he's a lot more leeway in terms of what he does rhythmically. He's able to be kind of more creative and deviate from what I think is the sort of kind of underlying rhythmic pattern dancers generally abide by. So just one other little thing I wanted to kind of point out. Music theorists working on West and Central African rhythms often sort of highlight dance steps as being one indicator of where dancers sort of beat to which they're coordinating to. And so I wanted to highlight a little bit of this for the first song. So this is I'm going to show you another video of another view. So this is Gerard Kubik's The Beat Accepted by Listeners can be found quite easily by looking at the dancers. A regulative beat is often internalized in the form of dance steps. So let's take a look at some dance steps here. So I'm going to play you a little bit of the video first, just so you can see it, and then I'm going to kind of point out some things to pay attention to. All right, so this song is saying, so that the words in Medʉmba are achuba ba, achuba ta ba ba, achuba ba. And that alternates with achuba ya. So the first way that I said it, it meant it speaks from the river, it speaks from the big river, or literally the sort of father river. And then it alternates with it speaks where, and then it goes back to it speaks from river. So the Baba River is the name of the river. So the sort of the words that I had, or the stem initial syllables that I had pointed out to you earlier when I showed you the text setting pattern, the stem initial syllable in chuba, which is to speak, so chuba. Then this ta, which means big or father of the name of the river, the Baba River. So I want you to sort of try and see if you can notice where the chup and the ta are showing up, and the chup and the ba in the alternating lines. And in particular, pay attention to what's happening with arms moving and what's happening with feet moving. All right, so that goes by pretty fast, and I might to get all of it, but maybe you saw that the feet going there were landing on basically chuba ba, a chuba ta ba ba, a chuba ba, so occurring on that father of and that stem initial syllable for the beginning of the name of the river. And then the arms are actually swinging back and forth so that the sort of backward apex of the movement is aligned chup. The forward apex of movement is aligning with ta or ba. So we have a nice alignment of dance steps in addition to what we saw with the musical beats. So to conclude this part of the talk, coordinated patterns in metrical structure in Medʉmba are evident from these text setting patterns. That being said, in Medʉmba, just like in many other cultures, involves an interplay between linguistic structure and expression. So we saw some variability, for example, between the dancers and the master drummers of exactly which beats stem initial and non-initial and affix syllables were showing up. And part of that is probably to do with the sort of elevated creativity that the master drummer did to show in this context. And then finally, this sort of link between structure and musical rhythm and the body in these dance steps that we saw. And so that brings us to the last part of this talk, which has to do with alignment with the body, another form of alignment with the body in the form of co-speech gesture. And this is joint work with Herman Kupjo, who's at Western University, or collaborative piece. And the question here is, what role does metrical structure play aspects of speech body coordination in the form of co-speech gesture? And are these patterns sort of similar to what we see in other languages?
Katie, I think there might be a problem with the mic connection, or maybe with your headphone connection. There's like a little buzzing that's happening every
sorry about that.
minute or so. I'm not sure.
Is it still there?
I think it's okay. I'm not having it. I think it was.
Okay, all right. I've detached my headphones. Hopefully that will solve the problem. Let me know if it continues. So, so co-speech gesture, just to give an overview, it's a type of gesture that accompanies speech, and it's been shown to show kind of key properties in terms of its prosodic alignment with speech. Co-speech gestures are sort of differentiated from signs, and sign languages, they tend to be less conventionalized. They don't need to be meaningful. They can be, so they can be kind of meaningless. The line between gesture and sign is a bit fuzzy sometimes, but those are the kind of general ways that we would distinguish them. And in particular, I'm kind of interested in these especially meaningless gestures, beat gestures, which appear to be universal across languages. They involve a stroke of the arm or the hand. They can involve a head gesture. They can involve hugs or eyebrow raises, or a variety of other forms. And basically, their sort of main function appears to be kind of prosodic in nature, whether they're marking or kind of amplifying the prosody. So in particular, we find that these types of gestures like to align with, for example, pitch accented syllables in languages like English. So generally, we think of beat gestures as being non-iconic. So iconic gestures being, for example, if I'm asked to describe a recipe and you're talking about stirring, you might do something like this. Which clearly is very closely related to the actual action of stirring. So mainly we think of these as not being those types of iconic gestures, although iconic gestures too can be, can have prosodically important timing. So we don't necessarily want to kind of separate it completely. So what types of syllables do we see in co-speech gestures in Medʉmba? So we are following the MIT Gesture Studies coding manual from the MIT Speech Communications Group for this. They're annotating different phases of the gesture, including the preparation phase, the stroke containing the apex, a hold, and then recoveries, which are not marked here. So this is an example of a manual gesture like this. You can see I just said manual, like with my stress syllable. So basically, for a gesture like this, we usually see a preparation phase where the person is bringing their hands up to get ready for the sort of main event in the gesture. And the stroke is the sort of most intentionally most important part of the gesture. And that contains the apex, which is going to be crucial for our purposes here. So the apex is defined as the point of zero acceleration of the hands in this case. So basically you're accelerating towards this point, the point at which your fingers tend to be maximally extended, and then you start to slow down after you've reached that point. So these apexes are especially important landmarks for timing of speech and gesture. They've been shown in languages to be the things that most especially like to align with prosodic events in speech. Finally, we have the hold. So you may finish the stroke and then leave your hands in the same position, basically, and that's hold. And then the recovery would be when you relax the hands away from the gesture. The data presented today are from 2 Medʉmba speaking participants. They were video recorded together in January 2020. They were interviewed about various aspects of traditional life, so marriage, important funeral ceremonies, etc. And we've been annotating the gestures according to the coding scheme that I showed you before. And we've also been, in addition to the gestures, annotating vowels, specifically vowels which align with the apex of the gesture, or in cases where we don't have a perfect alignment of the gesture apex with a vowel, the vowels immediately preceding and the vowels following the apex of the gesture. And we're interested in seeing kind of what morpheme types or syllable types are occurring in those various different positions. And based on previous work, we sort of expect that the apex of gestures, previous work I should say on English largely, we expect that the apex of gestures is going to generally align with or slightly precede the vowel, the relevant vowel, especially vowels that are metrically prominent. Okay, and so in the case of Medʉmba, we expect that these stem syllables are going to kind of, stem initial vowels are going to be those key metrically prominent vowels that are going to align with apexes. So as we've been working through the corpus, there have been 2 sort of patterns that show up. Sometimes we get a kind of nice alignment of our apex with a vowel. Here's an example of a vowel that occurs like within the apex of the gesture. So the apex theoretically is really just one single point in time of zero acceleration within the hand gesture, for example. Here, because we're video data, we don't have as precise landmarks as we would with, say, motion capture technology. And so we're basically we're sort of looking frame by frame to see how much has moved in time across different frames and using that as our metric for where the apex lies. And so we can't be as pinpointed about it. So we're rather sort of designating a kind of range as being where the apex lies. And then the other pattern that we get when we don't get this perfect alignment of the apex with a particular vowel is that we get a vowel sort of preceding the apex and then another vowel kind of following it. And the question here is, when you don't have alignment of the apex with any particular vowel, what should be the relevant vowel that we assume is kind of pulled to the apex? We sort of don't know whether it's the one that comes before it or the one that comes after it. So that's kind of part of what we're trying to figure out. Overall, you can see that it was less than to see perfect alignment. This middle bar is showing you how often we got alignment of a vowel with the apex of the gesture. And you can see that it was more common that we got a preceding or a following, or usually both. So no, these are showing the number of times that we got preceding / following without an aligned vowel. So I want to kind of point out a point that's made by Leonard and Cummins in their 11 paper looking at beat gestures and alignment to speech. And they say that simultaneity of two events is not that the two events are tightly coupled, and basically argue that rather than trying to find things perfectly aligned, what we should try to find is two things seem to have a kind of fixed lag in time. Okay, it could either be aligned or sort of have a fixed temporal relation to one another that isn't perfect alignment. But this sort of this sort of lesser variability in alignment patterns is the kind of thing that will tell you whether two things are coupled to one another or not. So on that note, let's take a look at relative variability in timing of vowels as they occurred preceding the gesture apex, aligning with the gesture apex, following the gesture apex. So the dotted line here represents the location of the apex. And you can see when we had aligned vowels that occurred sort of perfectly in time with the apex, variability was pretty low. Okay, so we have a small interquartile range here. You can see that in these cases, the set of the apex slightly preceded the vowel, which is from previous work. That's a very common pattern that's been found in previous work. When we had vowels preceding the apex, they tended to show greater variability. When we had vowels following apex, they were relatively less variable than the preceding vowels, but not as, but had slightly greater variability than the aligned vowels. So if we had to sort of say from this, based on the Cummins statement that I highlighted before, we would sort of assume that after aligned vowels, probably the following vowels are the most likely to be kind of coupled to the apex, given the relatively lower variability than these preceding vowels. So as I mentioned, this pattern of seeing the apex sort of just precede a target vowel is a very common pattern that we see across lines in terms of the relationship between the speech and gesture. This is actually the latency here is pretty late. Most languages that I've read so far, you don't tend to find vowels occurring that long after a beat gesture, but that seems to be one pattern that we're seeing here. So now kind of breaking down the results across these different positions, so the preceding, aligning, following positions of these vowels relative to the apex of the beat gesture, we're breaking down by syllable type, by basically what type of syllable was occurring there. And you can see all three positions. We found a large number of stem initial syllables for these vowels around the apex of the gesture. But we actually found a lot of stem initial syllables when that gesture was perfectly aligned with a vowel. Okay, so aligned with a vowel, what it tended to be was a stem initial syllable. When the followed the apex of the gesture, it was also likely to be a stem initial syllable, though less likely than when it was aligning. And it was more varied. We looked at the preceding vowel. Okay, so the type of morpheme or the type of syllable that occurred pre-gesture tended to be more variable. So this is maybe some additional kind of evidence to suggest that what follows is the relevant thing when you don't have a perfectly aligning vowel, that it's the vowel that follows this that's the kind of most tightly coupled to that gesture. And just for fun, I pulled out some tone information too to take a look. So this is a underline that has two tones, high and low, but we can also form contour tones, falling and rising contours by concatenating, for example, a tonal morpheme to a segmental morpheme. So overall, we find pretty similar patterns across these different positions that the vowel would occur in to the apex of the gesture. So some high tones, some high-low tones, some low tone, low-high tones. Preceding and aligned vowels tended to have very, very similar in terms of the tones that they carried, proportionally speaking. We find slightly more high tone vowels in trailing vowels, and vowels that would follow the beat gesture, but only very slightly. So largely these patterns were there. So to conclude this part of the talk, gesture apexes were likely to align with stem initial syllables. For gestures without any aligned syllable, timing was less variable and syllable type was more predictable for syllables that follow gesture apex than syllables that preceded the gesture apex. And then all tones appear in all alignment positions, although low tone is somewhat more common in preceding and aligning syllables, high tone is somewhat more common in following syllables, although that's a pretty marginal pattern. And I just kind of wanted to quickly talk about before saying some sort of themes that are kind of starting to emerge regarding variation and flexibility in alignment patterns that we're seeing. So for example, we've seen across the text setting example that I gave for Medʉmba versus English that, coming from using the sort of Western notation method, you find that different parts of the measure might be the thing to which we find metrically strong syllabing, so odd versus even numbered beats. And then likewise with co-speech gesture, these instances of trailing vowels, which followed the apex of the gesture, that seems to be a pattern that I have not come across in looking at other languages. I should say that this new grant that I'm working on is specifically designed to look at these patterns across languages. So we don't have the data yet, but that's sort of the place to look at how widespread this pattern is. And I sort of relate this to another pattern that I didn't tell you about already with regard to each cycling task that I introduced as the first part of the talk. So recall that people were repeating sentences in time to a metronome at these different speeds. That we actually were using were not related to the metronome itself when we were calculating relative phase within the speech cycle. It was just the successive utterances of themselves that we were using as those landmarks to measure timing. And a kind of interesting thing happened in the task in which when this task has been carried out with speakers of all of these other languages that it's been done on, the instruction speaking is that you ask speakers to repeat the first syllable of the sentence in time with the metronome beat. And generally speaking, people, for English speakers, certainly this tends to be what they do. You don't even necessarily, like someone like me, if you asked me to do this task, that would be what I would do without even to be told. But Medʉmba speakers actually really strongly preferred not to align first syllables with the metronome beat, and this is the pattern that they produced. So, for example, when we might expect something like dig for a duck, dig for a duck, dig for, what they would do instead was something like dig for a duck, dig for a duck, dig for a duck. So a little bit for the beat. And this was the pattern that we found at lower speeds, okay, at speech rates of the metronome. But as we sort of cranked up the speed of the metronome, we see that speakers are moving from repeating somewhere sort of around a third of the through the metronome cycle. At faster rates, they actually fall in phase with the metronome. Most people do anyway. So this is the metronome beat up here, and you can see that as we crank up the metronome speed, the alignment pattern tends to change. Speakers tend to start to line up with them once they kind of cross a certain threshold. Not everyone does. Some speakers kind of resist. So this speaker actually didn't align for like the whole task. And this speaker is sort of going back and forth after task. But in any case, So there's two lessons to take. The first one, I sort of panicked when this was happening because I wondered whether this was going to make it so that all of my dissertation results were, not going to be meaningful. So this is one of my messages to all of you students who are like at the dissertation phase or close to it is, don't be scared of patterns that you weren't expecting, because sometimes they can be really interesting and important. So I talked to the guy who created this paradigm, and he said, don't worry, actually, since you're using the repetition cycle as your cycle metric, this actually doesn't matter, but this is really interesting. We've never seen this before. We've never seen this approaching the task in this way. And I think it sort of speaks to this idea that alignment isn't always the goal in coordination. And one thing that we should sort of be careful of, talk about kind of coupling patterns between speech and gesture, or speech and music, or what has that. Aligning things with each other is not the only way that we can observe things be kind of closely coupled to one another, closely coordinated to one another. So this is kind of one example of that. So anyway, as far as the takeaways, I'll wrap up now. The role of metrical prominence is pretty far reaching, we've seen in Medʉmba, as it is in many other languages. And given the variety of ways in which metrical prominence can be manifested phonetically across languages through stress using potentially different correlates, some languages kind of prefer using duration, some languages put more emphasis on pitch. Pitch accent languages, arguably are doing something sort of similar to stress, but mainly with pitch. Some languages may not use any of those cues. It may be that coordinative patterns provide some of the most useful unifying properties of metrical prominence across languages, where we see this variation in phonetic properties. And this is in line with something that van der Hulst et al. Has argued for. They say that phonetic and phonological correlates of metrical prominence at the word level is through the grammaticalization of what they refer to as low-level rhythm. This is the proposal that they made. And they take this low-level rhythm to be a universal property of languages. They don't really specify what they mean by low-level rhythm. And so I'd like to submit that maybe what we could mean by low-level rhythm is this kind of coordinative property that, that probably most languages have in some form. And then I think the interesting question from there is why it is that languages develop these different phonetic correlates of prominence the way that they do. There's many different reasons probably contributing to that. So there are phonological structure, tonal versus tonal languages, syntactic structure, information structure, and possibly even preferred coordinations themselves may actually be responsible for some of these differences. So with that, I will wrap up. Thank you all very much. Malapta I will stop sharing.